NTV Wild Talk in partnership with the Kenya Wildlife Service and Wildlife Direct.
Hello and welcome to NTV Wild Talk with me, Smriti Vidyarthi. Now, recent reports have revealed that Kenya's wildlife is declining, and many blame it on livestock. But my guest today says that the future of Kenya's wildlife depends on livestock. Before I get chatting to him, have a look at this. In Kenya, millions of lives, both human lives and wildlife, depend on land that is healthy and nutritious. It is particularly critical for those in the business of agriculture and farming, and for pastoralists whose livelihoods depend on grazing cattle. Wild animals, the grazers, also depend heavily on grasslands, as this is what they feed on. So when the land in need dries up due to ineffective rainfall and consequential drought, those millions of lives are at risk. People, cattle and wildlife move in search for the grass greener on the other side. But more often than not, they end up competing, and this competition for healthier land can turn violent. In this episode, we explore the possible solution to regenerating land. Well, joining me now is Allan Savory, an ecologist. Welcome to NTV Wild Talk. Pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me here.
What does an ecologist do, and what exactly does your work involve?
Well, I gave you the title ecologist or biologist, but ecology is really the study of how life forms interconnect, what's going on in farms and ranches and national parks with biodiversity, and how the soil life, the plants, the animals all interact. And then I very much have brought humans into that early on in my work. So I wouldn't say I'm a conventional ecologist at all.
Right.
But that's sort of where I started, with my deep concern with wildlife, and then seeing that what was affecting wildlife was also affecting humans.
And how long ago did you start this sort of work?
Oh, way back in the early 50s. And I first came to Kenya in 1960. It was my first visit here. And I've been coming here off and on since. So I'm somewhat familiar with your problems,
right,
which really are global problems. They're not very different from whether we're dealing with Australia or China or Israel or wherever.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll get into that in just a moment. But what inspired you to get into this kind of work?
Just a passion for wildlife. And so I went to university on the advice of a godfather of mine. Didn't actually plan to go to university. I just wanted to join the game department. And so I went to university and then joined the game department when I was 20 with a basic degree in botany and zoology, plant ecology, animal ecology, very basic degree. And then I began to see that what the reality of what I was seeing with wildlife areas in Africa that we were setting aside as future national parks because they were so beautiful and full of wildlife and beautiful vegetation and stable rivers and so on. And I began to see these deteriorating very quickly after we gave them protected status and removed the people who'd been beating drums for centuries and had old muzzle-loading guns and so on, and who lived in these areas. We took the people out. We lied like good bureaucrats and said we were taking them out for their own good because of sleeping sickness, which was nonsense.
Wow.
We were taking them out because we intended to make national parks.
Really?
But I began to see them deteriorate amazingly quickly.
And what was the cause of that deterioration?
Well,
and where exactly was this as well?
Mostly in the Luangwa Valley in what was northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, and then the lower Zambezi Valley in what is now Zimbabwe, were two of the areas where I particularly saw this. But it was all over. I was seeing deterioration in very wild areas with no livestock in them, and when everybody was blaming livestock for desertification, and they still do in Kenya, as you've seen. But I was seeing deterioration where there was no livestock. And then I was also involved in a terrible policy we had in Zimbabwe in those early days of eradicating the wildlife for tsetse fly control, to try to prevent the tsetse fly, affecting cattle. And so we had big swaths of the country where we shot everything, from elephants down to the smallest animals, and tried to wipe out the game. And I was for a year in charge of some of those areas as well, and fortunately with a very open-minded director in the tsetse department, and me providing him with data and helping, we were able to finally shut that down. It was so ridiculous. But even in those areas where we now had no livestock and no big game, I was seeing terrible deterioration. So nothing was making sense.
Right. Well,
and nothing was jibing with what I was taught at university.
Mm-hmm.
So really I just began my whole education over again.
Well, I've got to pick up on the point that you made, that you had to shoot wildlife. What was that like, and did that even really, well, you say it didn't really help the situation?
No, it didn't help the situation at all, but the thinking was, and it was mostly driven by veterinarians and entomologists at the time, was that if you shot out all the game, you would deny the flies a blood supply, and then the flies would not reinvade after they had receded at about the time of the rinderpest. They were blaming the recession of tsetse fly, where the fly belts had receded dramatically following rinderpest, on the destruction of game by rinderpest. But that wasn't making sense either, because many of the animals that the flies fed on when we did blood samples, etc., were animals that were not affected by rinderpest. So there was a lot of myth and story, and it was very difficult to sort out fact from fiction. But clearly that tsetse fly, that game eradication program to control the fly, was nonsense, and we stopped it.
So you mentioned that you got people out of the game parks to try and protect the land. You got livestock out if there was any in there, and then some wildlife as well. Yet you still saw the deterioration.
Yes.
So what was the reason?
I was taught that livestock are causing the problem. I was taught that, and it made sense. It seemed logical, etc. But when I saw these big future national parks deteriorating badly, then the logic was simple. It had to be too many animals. Now, it wasn't cattle or sheep or goats, because we didn't have any in those areas.
Right.
So it had to be too many elephants, too many buffalo, etc. We scientists don't believe what we see. We're humans. We tend to see what we believe. And so I actually coined the words game ranching, believing that if we could ranch the animals, the wildlife in situ, and get rid of the livestock, we could stop the land degradation. So I began that with a program to try and ranch the lechwe in the Banguelu swamp. And I still have my first draft of that.
Oh, really?
With Sir Frank Fraser-Darling's corrections of my English,
Oh, wow.
which he didn't like too much. But and I tried to get him to put the idea rather than a 20-year-old youngster, but he wouldn't take my idea. But anyway, later, with American Fulbright scholars who had come up with a similar idea, we got the game ranching industry going. And it's now a multi-billion-dollar industry in Texas and South Africa, etc. But I've looked at many farms, including the best game ranch I've known managed, and still the land is deteriorating. So game ranching using just wildlife wasn't working. If you come to the parts of Africa that I'm living in near the falls, we're surrounded by big national parks: Wangi, Chobe, Kazuma, Zambezi National Park, Livingstone National Park, Kafue, Zambezi, and we're positioned in the middle. Now, the worst loss of biodiversity and habitat destruction is in the national parks. So it's still going on, but when it began, I just logically said it has to be too many elephants, which is what people are still blaming. And so I did the research. I proved we had too many elephants. It's easy to prove what you believe.
Yeah.
And so the data was gathered, the proof was there. That was absolute political dynamite, because nobody was talking about culling game animals in a national park.
Of course.
And I was saying we're going to have to reduce these elephants, bring them down to a level the land can sustain, etc. So our government formed a committee under Ray Smithers and with other very respected scientists on it, and they looked at my work. We visited the field with me, we went over all the data, the evidence in the field. They agreed with me, and in the subsequent years our government went ahead and we shot 40,000 elephants. And somehow all my colleagues couldn't see that it got worse. It didn't get better. And as I said to you just a moment ago, the worst loss of biodiversity is in those national parks, and we're still blaming elephants.
Gosh.
So nothing is advancing
Right.
in the mainstream thinking, and that's been terribly frustrating. At least, thank goodness, I learned from that, okay, culling animals doesn't work, game ranching isn't working, national parks aren't working. What the hell will work?
Right, and before we get to that, when you talk about land degradation and the deterioration of the land, paint a picture of what you mean. Does it mean that, we're not seeing enough grass or shrubs? So, we can visualize it.
Okay, essentially, it's called desertification, land turning to desert.
Right.
Now, around Nairobi here, you've got enough rain, enough humidity. It doesn't happen. You can manage very, very badly. You'll get land degradation, but it will not turn to desert. Now, over most of Kenya, it's turning to desert. And that's what you need to be concerned with. Now, that very simply is because your available rainfall, it becomes less effective. So it's not that your rain or your climate change. That comes later.
Okay.
The early stages, it's our actions that make the available rainfall less effective. And I first saw that in 1960 when I came to Kenya. I was seeing the evidence of it. I was part of an international group, and you were in a terrible drought. There were piles of cattle dying and all these things, and bare ground all over. And the people in that scientific conference, they were all praying for Kenya to get good rains.
Yeah,
And
as
I was
we are
saying,
now.
yes, and I was saying, you better not pray for good rains. You're going to get terrible floods. This is not a drought.
Right.
This is non-effective rainfall. And I was showing them the evidence. You were growing cynodon dactylon this high,
And what's that?
couch grass.
Okay. a
We
type of
can't
grass.
grow it that high in Zimbabwe in the best of years.
Right.
But it was growing that high where nothing could get at it. And the sort of evidence was around and to be seen. So anyway, I was somewhat unpopular, and they're saying, why are you against Kenya? And I said, because if you get good rains, you're going to get terrible floods. Well, if you can think back to those days, you got good rains, and we actually had to send our Air Force up here to help you feed people,
Wow.
stranded villages and things. And nothing has changed since 1960. I'm still hearing exactly the same talk in Kenya. Now, that non-effectiveness of your rainfall is just because you've got too much bare ground between the plants.
And you did mention that it's not because of the animals or the livestock, it's because of human beings.
Yes.
How? What are we doing wrong?
Well, the belief is that livestock are causing it by overgrazing. Right? And you've got thousands of scientific dissertations and papers and PhD dissertations, and I've never found a single one that defines overgrazing. It's just overgrazing is too many animals. And what we know for sure, we don't define, we don't bother to. So we are all, my colleagues and so on, scientific colleagues, are all blaming livestock. Well, tonight I will show a picture of a national park in New Mexico, which has had no livestock now for nearly 100 years. No deer, no elk, no buffalo, bison, nothing. And it's, frankly, you'll see it's just deep gullies and erosion as bad as anything you've got in Kenya. And so this is really what I've been grappling with since the 1950s, that we were giving ourselves awards, having conferences, praising ourselves, etc., for the good work we're doing. But if we were honest with ourselves, in the field you see it just getting worse and worse and worse.
Why?
Now, well, because the rainfall's non-effective. Now that happens in what we call brittle environments.
Right.
Those are environments, like most of Kenya, where if you pick up dead leaves or twigs or anything that's dead, it'll crackle and crumple in your hands. If around Nairobi you pick up dead leaves and grass, they'll just softly crumple.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's in those environments we have long breaks without any rain at all. And in those, the soil life, the vegetation all co-evolved with millions and millions of large grazing animals. They were just as important as the soil life, as everything, and we have no conception of their numbers today. So when you talk about 1 million wildebeest, this is a remnant of what used to be, all right? And it was the same in the Americas and so on. If you look at the Americas, they've got 11 large mammal species now. But prior to humans arriving there with language, organization, fire, spear, they had apparently another 40 species of large mammals. You see, so we have no conception of what it was like before modern human. And we need to go back to that to understand it. So the things that cause a high percentage of the ground to be bare in Kenya and to cause your droughts and your floods that are man-made, and even the natural ones become 10 times worse because of our actions. There are very few things. The only things that cause a high percentage of bare soil between the plants are too few animals wandering around.
Oh, really?
Wild or domestic. Overgrazing plants, which has nothing to do with animal numbers, if you look at the science and not the beliefs. And so it's too few animals, too little disturbance, too little dung, urine. It doesn't keep the grass, which is the main component that provides soil cover over most of Kenya. That's what should provide the soil cover, not trees. Grass provides the bulk of the cover. Now, if you don't have enough animals there, the grass that grows when it does and is nice and green, it cannot shed its own leaves like a tree can.
Okay.
So when it dies in the dry season, all right, it needs to biologically decay rapidly before the next rains. And if there aren't animals there with the moisture in their gut, that biological decay doesn't happen. And it turns to chemical breakdown, oxidation. And you can see it all over Kenya. You'll see this going dark black, oxidizing, crumples up easily. And that kills the plants. And when we blame animals for it, no, it's the lack of animals.
Sure.
It was the opposite of what we believed.
Wow.
And counterintuitive.
All
So
right.
I've just, weekend before last, I was on one of the big ranches in New Mexico in the United States, well-managed ranch conventionally, and we were hawking actually because I'm a falconer, but I was looking at it, just miles and miles and miles of 2 to 3 species of grass that can survive not being grazed, because America's got hardly any cattle on the land. They've got millions in feedlots. And so the plants that are surviving are the ones that can survive without being grazed.
I see.
And they're blaming too many cattle.
Right, okay.
And-
All right, well, you know, there's so much more to discuss. Also, you know, the solutions, how to fix the problem, because you say in all this time, not much has changed. We need to take a break, though, right here on NTV Wild Talk. Do stay with us. My guest continues to discuss this fascinating topic, Allan Savory, an ecologist. You can join the conversation too. The hashtag is NTV Wild on Twitter, or like our NTV Wild Facebook page. Back in a moment. Welcome back to NTV Wild Talk with me, Smriti Vidyarthi. Remember, you can join the conversation. The hashtag is NTV Wild on Twitter, or like our NTV Wild Facebook page and leave your comments there. My conversation now continues with ecologist Allan Savory. Now, we were talking about grasslands all over the world, you know, and really how important they are. But, you know, for your layman who's watching this show, why are grasslands so critical, and how will it impact him and his family at the end of the day?
Well, it'll impact him totally, him or her totally. It's very difficult to exaggerate it. There is nothing more important than the grasslands, which are about 80% roughly, or 2/3 of the world, is essentially what I call brittle environment. Seasonal rainfall, so it's dry deciduous forests, savannas, grasslands, etc. But it's the areas of seasonal rainfall where the bulk of the soil cover is provided by plants. Now, it's vitally important to everything we're doing today, because the symptoms, these are treated as problems by your government and environmental organizations and so on. They're not problems. They're symptoms of desertification, or that droughts and floods increase in severity and frequency. And the natural droughts and floods, which are relatively rare, become 10 times worse than they should be. That's one of the symptoms. We treat it as a problem. Then with that you get poverty, social breakdown, abuse and blaming of minority groups, mass immigration across borders, Mexico into the United States, North Africa into Europe, which is changing the political face of Europe. You get massive provision of the recruitment conditions you need for ISIS and Al-Qaeda and dissident organizations. You're absolutely playing into their hands by providing the recruitment for these rogue organizations, be they religious or whatever. So the massive immigration to cities, which changes them. The violence and war, the Syrian war, started with this.
Yeah.
That's what began it, and
Really?
people are acknowledging it now. Oh yeah, non-effective rainfall, dry year, and people started flooding to the city, and look where it's gone.
Right.
And now all the movement into Europe and so on. So all of these, plus climate change, it's one of the biggest players. Now, I got criticized quite a lot by academics at the TED Talk, which I gave in 2013, because I said we scientists have only one option, and that is livestock, properly managed. Nothing else now can save humanity from climate change and these drastic things that are wrecking economies, violence, everything.
So livestock is part of the solution?
Not part of the solution.
Is
They're
the
the
solution?
only solution.
Only solution.
Now, I
Okay.
got criticized for
Yeah.
that because no reputable scientist will ever say only solution.
Yeah.
There are always lots of
Many,
options.
right.
So I can't even drink water now without using technology.
Yeah.
If I wanted to drink water now, I've got to go to the nearest river and drink with my hands and mouth. Unless I use a pipe, a tap, a glass, everything we do depends on technology. So we've got the tool of technology from the Stone Age to computers and the cameras you're using now and everything. All right? No technology even imaginable in science fiction can restore biological decay every year on billions of hectares right across North Africa, the Horn of Africa, Kenya, up into China, through to India, Australia, most of America, South America, up into Canada. No technology in the world can ever do it, even in science fiction.
You're so sure of that, and
Absolutely,
no doubt
because
critics...
it's a biological problem.
Right.
All right, so technology can never solve it.
Okay.
Now, what else have we got? We've got fire. That's what made the technology possible, and how we could move from the Stone Age into the Bronze, the Copper, and the Iron Age, and have all the technology we have today. Fire is rapid oxidation, and it exposes soil. So what other tools have humans got? We can protect it. National parks, conservation. Wonderful in humid areas where it restores biodiversity. That over-resting the land is the main cause of desertification in Kenya.
Wow.
The opposite of what we thought. So now we've gone through those tools, what else are we left with? Humans have no other tool except to use technology to plant trees, grasses and shrubs. Just like I'm using technology to drink the water. Well, people have done that. The United Arab Emirates, they've spent over $30 billion planting trees, desalinating water, irrigating the trees. The desert's just blowing through. China has planted millions of trees, and the desert's just marching into the cities, in effect. Israel, they've spent more than 10,000 euros per hectare planting trees, and the desert just carries on. And all of those countries are reducing livestock. The only thing that can reverse that desertification by restoring biological decay
Is livestock.
It's livestock.
So how does that work then?
If any scientist in the world, and I'm really sticking my neck out and challenging any scientist in Kenya, any scientist in the world, tell me where I'm wrong.
So according to you, how does that work then? How are we going to use livestock to restore deserted lands?
Well, this was the big dilemma I faced in the mid-1960s, because by then I'd realized, okay, we cannot do it with wildlife, we cannot do it with technology, we're going to have to look at livestock. Now, I was renowned for my antagonism to livestock. because it was a big issue with us in Zimbabwe.
Right.
And ranchers had come to me asking for my help, said, look, we've tried everything. We've followed the research stations, we've done everything the government or the research stations have said, but we acknowledge our land is getting poorer. We want your help. And I said, okay, I'll help you on one condition. And that is, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I don't have answers.
Okay.
But I'm determined we're going to find a solution to this. And so I began helping ranchers. Now, the dilemma I faced was how we were to do it. We'd had over 10,000 years of pastoralists, Samburu, Maasai, etc., extremely knowledgeable people. Their whole culture is their livestock, but they, with the herding of their livestock, had created the great man-made deserts of antiquity. So we knew that pastoralism is causing desertification, albeit very slower. Then we'd had modern range science and grazing rotations and grazing systems and fencing. And we picked up in Zimbabwe that was accelerating desertification.
Really?
The best of range science was accelerating it faster than pastoralists were causing it. So what do you do? We knew we had to use livestock. We knew that every way that humans had ever run livestock was causing desertification. So what do you do? And that was a big dilemma. So I looked at the work of a French pasture scientist, the guy who had discovered that overgrazing had nothing to do with animal numbers, but with the time of exposure of the plants.
Okay.
So whether you had one wildebeest or a million didn't make a difference other to the number of plants overgrazed. You cannot overgraze land. That's sticks and stones and soil.
Yeah.
You can only overgraze plants. So he had discovered that, and he had worked out why rotational grazing wasn't working in Europe and was leading to a loss of biodiversity, and he'd come up with a simple planning process. So I tried his planning process right away with rancher friends and clients and on my own ranches, and we fell on our faces. But it didn't mean he was wrong. I was sure he was right. The technique couldn't handle all the complications of Africa and wildlife and crops. So then I just looked for professions that might have had dealt with something even close to this in complication. And I just took the military, because for over 300 years, the military academies of Europe had tried to work out how to plan in very sharp, fast-changing situations on the battlefield.
Right.
So I just took Sandhurst British military training that we were doing as officers in the Rhodesian Army. I just took that training and said, goodness, these guys have solved that. I don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
They've done for 300 years.
Yeah.
They've worked out how to produce the best possible plan at any moment in time, no matter what's going wrong.
Right.
So I just took their planning.
Oh, wow.
And all I had to do was say, okay, they've planned how to work this out, no matter what the stress is on you and no matter how fast the scene is changing. But that's for a battle that lasts an hour or a week or a day or
Sure.
whatever. But pastoralists and ranchers and so on, they have to plan for a year, 2 years. So how could we do that? And that was simple, just put it on a chart. Because on a chart you can express many dimensions. You can express a year easily. So I just put their planning on a chart, cribbed theirs directly. That's why I always credit Sandhurst with the grazing planning that we do today.
Right.
And then that's become holistic plan grazing that we use today. Now, that worked immediately because it had 300 years work behind it. And we have never, ever had that fail yet.
Wow.
We've had thousands of people fail to do it,
Right.
which is different from
From it failing, yes, yes. So how did you reintroduce livestock onto land to, regenerate that sort of land?
Well, we just start with the livestock there. I've
Okay.
never seen anywhere where it's overstocked. That's a belief.
Right.
All right, so we start with whatever is there. If there's enough forage, if we had a big piece of land here, and there's enough twigs, leaves, weeds, whatever the animals are eating, to have only a few goats or whatever is there, we start with those. And we just plan the grazing. We divide the land up into divisions. They can just be paths, streams, a big elephant path, whatever that the people know. The pastoralists are extremely knowledgeable. They know their land. So if you came like to Zimbabwe, we've got our most advanced scheme going where many Kenyans have come down for training, The land is divided up into 10, but there's no fencing.
Okay.
And then we plan over the chart for a year or more ahead where to put those animals so that they fit with wildlife and any other uses on that land. So if you've got areas that are critical for grevy's zebra, foaling, or anything like that, you just make sure the livestock are not there during that time. So we just fit them to the land. We plan the grazing immediately, start concentrating the animals, increasing the animals as fast as we can, and their hooves start to break soil, capping, etc. Plants start to grow. Nothing is being overgrazed because we control the movement of the animals, where they're going, what we call getting the animals to the right place, right reason, right time. You know, right behavior, and the land starts to improve virtually immediately. Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. And how long does something like that take? What does it cost to do that? How much time, effort, and energy needs to go into something like that?
I don't want to be slick about that, but I'd prefer to say, what does it cost not to do it?
Okay.
It costs Kenya billions of dollars not to do it.
Really?
To do it costs almost nothing. Just education and training. It's a people problem now. Now that we've realized how people can solve this on the ground with the framework we use for their management, it's a people problem. So it's just a case of getting people together, getting people to talk and begin to solve it. The knowledge is there amongst the people. They've got almost all the knowledge they need. It's in our universities, our colleges, in our environmental organizations, all the people doing research on wildlife and everything. They've all got bits of knowledge, and you need to bring that into the planning. But livestock become a central part of it.
And what are the consequences for Kenya if we do not fix our own?
Well, I can promise you what the consequences of Kenya are, because I saw it here in 1960 when I came, and I said, I hope you don't get good rains and you got terrible floods. I'm seeing the same thing. I've been visiting Kenya now for over 55 years, and I just see it getting worse and worse and worse and worse. If you don't change the way you're developing policies, I'll stake my life on it. It's just going to get more and more violent, more and more, and you're part of the world situation. We cannot even take climate change seriously till we look at the soil destruction.
What is the Savory Institute doing?
The Savory Institute was not formed by me, I was part of it, but by younger people wanting to get a permanent place where we could build the knowledge and coordinate things around the world. But it really was developed to get the holistic framework into international consciousness as rapidly as we can, so that people can begin solving their problems as people are doing. So we have about 30 hubs around the world, the first one in Kenya now.
Okay.
And these are just locally led, locally managed hubs where people from farms, ranchers, pastoralists, from universities, from environmental organizations, just as humans, can get together, begin to manage holistically, show what can be done, and start spreading the knowledge as rapidly as we can.
Who would have thought that really livestock is the solution to a massive problem, but they are a massive solution. Allan, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
My guest today, Allan Savory, an ecologist, talking about the importance of grasslands. Pretty fascinating conversation. Right, from there we are now shifting focus on NTV Wild Talk. Here is our wild guest question. What is the term used to describe land turning to desert? What is the term used to describe land turning to desert? To participate, just like the NTV Wild Facebook page. Only answers posted on the timeline post that's associated with this question will be considered. The first person to answer correctly wins 2 nights for 2 bed and breakfast at Watamu Treehouse. Built high in the trees, its unique architecture gives you a 360-degree panorama of the Indian Ocean coastline on one side and native forest on the other. Plus, free entry for 4 people and a vehicle to any national park, courtesy of the Kenya Wildlife Service. 1 bottle of wine, courtesy of Wines of the World, and a gift hamper, courtesy of Wildlife Direct. Terms and conditions apply and can be found on the NTV Wild Facebook page. Last week's lucky winner was Kenneth Kinyua. And now here are some of the photos that you sent in for our Wild Pick segment. And on our Wild Pick segment, this is a snap of Albert Wayne. He was at Bamburi's Hala Park in Mombasa. Albert was touching this giant tortoise and feeding a giraffe. Albert was there to enjoy the beautiful nature. This is a photo of Ketty Gitonga. She was at the Lower Wildlife Conservancy, and in this snap she was feeding a baby rhino with formula milk. Ketty was there for an internship. In Nakuru, this is a photo of Charles Nyeno. He was painting beautiful elephants, and Charles says he's an artist whose work depicts wildlife, landscapes and culture. He hopes his elephant paintings help conservation efforts. Joan Mengich and Teddy Odhiambo were both at the Karura forest. They were on a bike ride. They both say they love nature and want to encourage people to visit the forest, as proceeds will go to the conservation of Karura. And then at Sarova Salt Lake Game Lodge in Savo, this is Winnie Wanjohi. She was enjoying the movement of a herd of buffaloes in the distant background, and Winnie says it's just lovely to be in the wild. If you want your photos showcased on our Wild Pick segment, just like our NTV Wild Facebook page and send in a good quality photo that shows you celebrating nature via private message. Include your full name, tell us where the photo was taken, what you were doing and why. Well, there are many people who think that Allan Savory's findings are counterintuitive, and there are several who think that they are just downright unbelievable. Well, we'd love to hear from you, so do leave your comment on our NTV Wild Facebook page or use the hashtag NTV Wild on Twitter. If you're interested in getting more information, just log on to savory.global. That's it on NTV Wild Talk with me, Smriti Vidyarthi. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next Tuesday at 10 p.m. Okay, outro? Okay. Well, many seemed... No, there are people who think... Okay, ready? To go? Really? Okay. Maybe I didn't breathe enough. Yeah, okay.
NTV Wild Talk, in partnership with the Kenya Wildlife Service and Wildlife Direct.